Hey, Pretty Girl Club. So today I want to address the question, are non-ADOS people the loudest about colorism? In short, I will say absolutely. I have noticed that a lot of the biggest female colorism channels are from people who do not have an African American background. Maybe they've got people from the Caribbean in their direct lineage. Maybe they're like a second generation American or something like that, or maybe even first generation. So yeah, if you look at Chrissy, I believe she has like a Caribbean background or something. If I'm not mistaken, I believe I Am Aloho is African, or her family is from some sort of African country. I believe that Queen Chioma is also, she has that sort of background. Even if you look at some of the channels that discuss celebrities, like the Impressive channel, I believe the content creator from there has a background that is directly from somewhere in Africa. Yes, there are lots of people who are here on YouTube who have been kind of dominating the colorism conversation for about the past decade. And I have noticed a pattern where a lot of them are not, they don't have a lot of ties to their African American lineage. So, but with that being said, though, I don't think that invalidates their claims because I do think colorism has always existed here in the US. So whether our population had a lot of people from Africa or not, I do think colorism existed before these YouTube channels came out, obviously. But with that being said, that's a part of why on this channel I talk about how a lot of these problems that these content creators talk about have nothing to do with their skin tone. For example, the people who say that Ice Spice being called pretty is colorism, well, no, colorism is when you directly disparage somebody else based on their skin tone. So somebody complimenting a person who happens to be light skinned, that is not light skin privilege. That's actually just pretty privilege. Being complimented for your beauty is pretty privilege. Being called beautiful or being told that you're beautiful, that's pretty privilege. Now, if somebody says you are pretty because you do not look like a dark-skinned, unambiguous black woman, okay, yes, then you can argue that that's colorism. But simply receiving compliments does not mean that it's based on colorism. And what I think a lot of the non-African American based content creators are missing is that a lot of them actually do have way more inferiority complexes other than just their skin tone. And I do believe that a lot of content creators hide behind the colorism talking points so they can narcissistically abuse those that they view as more privileged than them, even if those people are monoracial, like Chloe and Halle. People abuse the crap out of Chloe and Halle, saying that both of them benefited from colorism. And I'm not denying that. I understand that they're light skinned or because they don't have like a dark chocolatey type of skin tone, people perceive them differently. I understand that. By the way, side note, I do think that the more recent the immigration was in your family, the more potential there could be for you to have experienced discrimination based on that. And so I do think that sometimes if people have an inferiority complex about the countries they came from, that they can pass that on to their children. So let's say your mom or your dad immigrated from somewhere else and then they didn't get hired for something, but instead of calling it xenophobia, they called it colorism. I do think that that could be something that commonly happens because oftentimes what people call colorism is not actual colorism. If somebody says, hey, I do not like you because I feel like your skin tone is ugly, okay, fine. But simply not getting a date, there's no proof, like unless there is actual proof that this person did not want to date you specifically due to your color, then that's not an accurate representation of colorism. Same thing goes for getting hired at a particular job. I feel like a lot of people, if their parents came from another country and let's say the hiring manager was, they were discriminating against immigrants and they didn't hire them, I do feel like sometimes people call that colorism when in reality the person was discriminating against them based on the country they were from and not necessarily their skin tone itself. But I also think that when you look at a lot of the Black empowerment content creators, a lot of the women who have these victim mentalities, they tend to blame colorism when something is not colorism. So for example, Chloe and Halle Bailey, both of them are actually talented. Both of them are pretty, regardless of their skin tone. Ice Spice is pretty, regardless of her skin tone. If Ice Spice were dark skinned, she would still be just as pretty as she is light skinned. And so I've noticed that a lot of times there are a lot of holes in people's talking points when it comes to the colorism argument. And I absolutely believe that other inferiority complexes could be coming into play when you see some of these content creators talking, because I don't care what anybody thinks. I've said it on this channel plenty of times. Part of the reason why I hold African Americans accountable on this channel, men and women, is because I understand that African Americans are by far one of the most privileged people groups in the world. I don't care if you're poor. I don't care if you're from the ghetto. I don't care if you were from the hood or if you were raised in the projects. You are still from one of the richest countries in the world with an abundance of opportunities. I don't care if you're not at the top in the United States of America. You still have privilege by simply being here in the United States. And so that's why I come off sometimes on my channel as not having that much empathy. And that is because I understand that there are people from all over the world who have it way worse. And so I believe that everybody should take into account whatever advantages they do have and try to work off of those advantages. But let's say a person comes from a place that is like very collapsed, like a country that's very collapsed. And by the way, I'm not trying to throw shade because obviously I myself have a multiracial and multicultural background. You know, if it weren't for immigrants, I also would not be here in the United States. However, if you want to get back to immigrants in my family, like on my mom's side, you would have to go back like 5 generations or something. Like not even my great grandparents were immigrants. It was like my great great grandparents or something like that. So I can actually trace my ancestry back to African Americans in Louisiana, and I can trace my ancestry back that way. Like their names are actually listed, like I have the documentation and all that. But I have noticed that sometimes if people feel displaced, not just because of their complexion, but also because of things like maybe their nationality, maybe if they have some sort of accent, maybe they are not masterful at the English language, I know that there are all types of other forms of discrimination that a person can face here in the United States. And I've noticed that a lot of people, like let's say somebody is xenophobic and they don't hire a Nigerian person because of like their accent or something like that. Obviously that's illegal, but I wouldn't automatically call it colorism. So there are so many different forms of discrimination, and I do think that sometimes people say that certain things are colorism when it's actually not colorism. It's based on something else. There's some other reason why that person is not succeeding in the way that they want to. But I do think that for a lot of people, they could have inferiority complexes about multiple different things. I mean, I can see how somebody might think, oh shit, my skin's holding me back, my hair texture's holding me back, my facial features are holding me back, my country is fucked up, I'm displaced from my family. So yeah, I do think that those are things that some of the mainstream colorism content creators do not address on their YouTube channels. And the reason that I feel comfortable addressing this is because obviously I was born and raised here, so were my parents, so were my grandparents, so were my great-grandparents. It's funny because when I actually first started this YouTube channel, I got rejected by the Hispanic YouTube community because they were saying that I am not, I'm not Hispanic enough. I don't count basically because I do not have a living ancestor who directly like came here from Mexico. So if you look at my family tree, they've all been born and raised in America as far back as, 4 or 5 generations or something like that. So because I'm not a first, second, or third generation immigrant, I've noticed that some people, they will classify you differently if you are not like a direct immigrant when it comes to the Latin American community. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Latin American people have been in this country for hundreds of years. Like Latin American people have been coming to this country and helping build this country just like other groups of people. So there seems to be this pervasive stereotype when it comes to Hispanics that if you are Hispanic, that like you must be born in Mexico, or like your parents had to have been born in Mexico, or your grandparents. And it's like, no, for some people, it's their great-grandparents or their great-great-grandparents or something like that. So I do think that some people have inferiority complexes with their own nationalities. And so the only way that they feel solidarity is if they can relate to your nationality. And then if they can't, I have noticed some people view you as more privileged because they associate their nationality with struggle, just like how they may associate their skin tone or their phenotype with struggle. Think about the people who come here from other countries who have accents. You get extreme discrimination based on your accent. People will assume who you are, and they assume your socioeconomic status based on things like your accent. A lot of people have actually come onto my channel. I've had white people, and it's funny because I've been working on this now. I've been working on my African American vernacular English, but I've had white people come on my channel and try to say, I'm a white man or I'm a white woman, and I can tell that the content creator behind this channel is white. And they're saying that because they're stereotyping me based on the way that I speak. And so think about all of the people who come from all over the world, and they're unambiguous, and they come from all these countries all over the world, and not only do they feel like they're experiencing colorism, texturism, and featurism, but they're also experiencing people discriminating against them for their accent, or people discriminating against them because they don't have mastery of the English language. So imagine being the child or grandchild of these people and having your mom or grandma tell you, I feel unprotected, I got fired from my job because of colorism, we are the least protected in society, no one wants to date or marry us. I can see a person saying that and mistaking that for colorism when in reality it has more to do with their background and them being culturally different. Or the isolation that people face. You know, let's say you are one of the only people from your family who lives here in the United States, or it's just you and your immediate family. You don't have your whole entire extended family here. You can't track where your family was living in the United States. So you didn't grow up having dozens, if not hundreds, of extended family members and relatives living here in this country. You couldn't go over to your cousin's house or grandma's house or auntie's house. You didn't have family reunions every summer. You didn't have cookout. What cookout? Your whole family is in Nigeria. Some people had to fly to entirely different continents just to see their extended family members, and that can actually lead to a feeling of isolation or lead to a feeling of having no one who is relatable to you. And so I do think that a lot of these content creators, they don't take that into consideration, and oftentimes they call things colorism, texturism, and featurism when it has more to do with their backgrounds of origin or maybe not having family support here. A lot of people who have family members, like immediate family members who come from other countries, sometimes if your family is just trying to get to the United States, or if you are struggling financially, a lot of times people who have direct immigrant backgrounds may not have access to the same resources for mental health or just other things in general. They may not know about the programs and stuff. And so all of these things are also contributing factors to inferiority complexes and psychological issues. But I've noticed that this is something that a lot of these other content creators do not address. One thing that actually bothers me is when people say that African Americans have no culture, or they say that like African Americans, we don't have any sort of identity. That's actually false. Anybody who is American, anybody who was born and raised here, or whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were born and raised here like myself, we do have a sense of culture and camaraderie here. In fact, I personally believe that African American culture actually influences other cultures all over the world. And I'm not saying that other cultures can't influence us here. By the way, if you come into my comment section to argue, that's fine. You'll just instantly be banned. If you want to respond from your platform. But yes, I have thought about that before and about how some of the colorism content creators are just trying to tie everything down to their skin tone, when in reality, there are more things that are affecting their experiences other than just their skin tone. It could be cultural differences. Like that's another thing. Some people who are from other countries, they have some cultural differences to the United States. So let's say you have some cultural differences and then you go into an American corporate work setting or an American office setting. Yeah, some people might have trouble interacting with you. And I think that those are all things that a lot of the other mainstream colorism content creators don't take into consideration. And I have noticed that sometimes people who are from countries that are more homogenous have a tendency to call things racist and colorist when they're actually not. And the reason they're saying that is because that person themselves, they come from a background that is so monocultural to the point where everybody in their whole country looks like them, or everybody in their whole entire country has a similar phenotype or a similar skin tone. They all have a similar culture. But here in America, because it's such a melting pot, I think that sometimes people, they will come here, or their parents or grandparents come here, and they have such a huge culture shock to the point where they don't have any other words or any language to describe their experiences other than words like colorism or texturism or featurism, because those are the only differences they can point out, because maybe in their country it is not as nuanced, or maybe it's not as much of a melting pot as what we are here in the United States. And so because they don't have all of those hundreds, if not thousands, of nuances within their own countries, because their whole country was maybe focused on overcoming some sort of civil war or, like something else, then they don't really have a language sometimes to describe their experiences. And I've also noticed for some of these colorism content creators, let's say one side of their family is African American. So let's say their father is African American. We all know that a lot of the mainstream Black women content creators talk about how African American men often abandon their families or abandon their parents. So for the women who do have African Americans in their family, maybe their dad was African American and he did not raise them, or he wasn't in their life or whatever. And so maybe the only cultural upbringing they knew was maybe their Caribbean upbringing or their Haitian upbringing or Nigerian or whatever country they're from. And so because their family members did not have words to describe this discrimination they were facing, the only thing they could think of was colorism, texturism, or featurism. But why does no one ask some of these content creators, like, hey, what culture were you raised in? Were you raised by your African American side, or were you raised kind of like in more of the Haitian culture? How did those nuances affect your views? I've noticed that nobody asks questions to women like that, but they ask tons of questions to multiracial Black women. And another question that I have for these content creators is, where did you first learn about colorism? Who was the first person to say something colorist to you? Because I can pretty much guarantee it was most likely a monoracial, unambiguous, dark-skinned Black woman or man. So whether it was your own mother, your own father, whether it was your Haitian mother, your Haitian father, your African American mother, your African American father, a Black boy at school, a Black girl at school, that's something else that I've noticed that a lot of these content creators don't address. Instead, it's we're competing with the quote-unquote preferences. We're competing with the quote-unquote exoticals. And another thing that I've noticed, I'm probably going to make a video about it, I've noticed that the majority of the content creators who talk the most about light-skinned women, such as Chrissy, tend to date Black men in particular, or they tend to maybe date Black men exclusively. I know that the Mademoiselle dates Black men. I've shown some pictures of some of these women's husbands and stuff like that, or their boyfriends. A lot of these women, they primarily date Black men, and they also have a belief that Black men don't like Black women, or Black men don't like dark-skinned Black women. And so that's actually where they got the term preferences from. So they were so male-centered to the point where they created a term preferences, meaning that you are a preference to a Black man. Do you see how Black male-centered that terminology actually is? And so that's why I'm glad that we have this space over here to talk about this. By the way, I'm not trying to shade other countries. Obviously, I have so many different countries on my DNA test. So it's not about throwing shade, but yes, I do think that African Americans are by far the most privileged Black people in the world. I stand 10 toes down on what I said. When you look at quote unquote Black culture, it does tend to center around Black Americans or mixed race Black Americans or quote unquote light skinned Black Americans or whatever. So I can see how people from other countries can view that as a form of privilege. And so I feel like a lot of unambiguous people from these other countries, maybe their families come to the United States and they came from a background of where only their skin tone and their features and their hair texture held them back, or that's how they felt. But then they come here and now they've got all these other obstacles to overcome. So now, the economy is different. Maybe they're lacking in education privilege or, just other things. Another thing that people don't talk about is how many Black immigrants were actually wealthy in their home countries. So imagine what a culture shock that is, to go from being African royalty or, being kind of at the top and being wealthy in your home country or in your family's country of origin, to coming here and now experiencing poverty for the first time, or experiencing being perceived as being poor for the first time, or maybe the value of the dollar in the country that you came from is nowhere near the same value of the dollar here in the United States. And so I just feel like there are so many other nuanced obstacles that a lot of people have to deal with as Black immigrants that are not addressed on these colorism channels. And I think that because a lot of them maybe didn't have a language to describe the hardships that they were going through, they just threw it all under colorism, texturism, and featurism. I mean, think about it. If you're coming from a different person, you may have to open a whole new bank account, or learn a whole new language, or learn how to interact in a professional setting. Maybe you want to go get your driver's license, but like you don't have your ID, or you didn't know that like your ID expires after a certain point and you have to go get a new ID, and you didn't know how many police officers are out on the street pulling people over for speeding tickets. And so if you get pulled over and maybe you actually were speeding and maybe you didn't realize it or something and you just got pulled over, you may equate that to, oh, it's because I'm black, or because of colorism, texturism, or featurism. And I think that sometimes a lot of people, they conflate cultural differences with racism. And sometimes people will say things like, oh, they pulled me over because I'm a dark-skinned black woman. And it's like, okay, well, were you speeding? Were your tabs expired? And by the way, I'm not saying that discrimination doesn't exist, but I do think that sometimes people overlook these nuances. It's like, were you speeding? Were your tabs expired? Was your license expired? Also, where were you driving? Were you in a small town where they need the money from speeding tickets to support that small town? Or were you in a very big city to where police officers are too busy dealing with real crimes to actually, drive around and have a speeding gun on the side of the road? Like, a lot of people who come from other parts of the world don't understand these nuances. Like, a lot of police officers and stuff, they do have actual jobs. Some people even say that they have quotas for like how many tickets they can hand out or how many people they can pull over. And by the way, I am not trying to diminish people who have been discriminated against by the police. I'm just trying to point out some of the nuances that people from other countries may not understand. Because one thing I have experienced in my dealings with people who have backgrounds from other countries is that sometimes people like to stereotype the United States simply based on what they see in the media. So if all of this propaganda about the United States has been flooded into your country of origin, that, oh, they killed this black guy, or that, they did all this bad stuff in the United States, they're super corrupt, and then maybe your family happens to immigrate here, are you taking into consideration that maybe some of the views that you have on Americans or on Black Americans could be based on things like stereotypes? That's another thing that a lot of these content creators refuse to address. Maybe they have all of these other issues that they never thought about before because everybody in the whole country was poor, or like, everyone within their immediate vicinity was very poor and lived in like maybe some sort of shack or something. And I'm not saying that to be rude, but seriously, there are some countries out there that are like that, where the gap between rich and poor is really, really huge. And I know that the gap between rich and poor is huge here, but also the standard of living here is generally higher than in a lot of other places. And so I think that sometimes because of that culture shock and because people from these other places, they don't understand the nuances of what life in the United States is like, I do feel like sometimes they can internalize that and just interpret it as, oh, it must be because of my color. It must be because of my skin tone. It has to be because I have 4C hair. It must be because my nose is big. And in reality, it's like, no, we've got all these different systems and protocols in the United States that are affecting your everyday life. I mean, this is a capitalistic country. You have to pay for healthcare, the job market. We've got people lying in the media and shit, like the politics. There's corruption in the politics. And so, yes, I've noticed that some people, they just conflate all of those different nuances, and then they just throw it all under racism, colorism, texturism, and featurism. And then on top of that, let's say you are of African American descent. Let's say you are an ADOS woman, if that's what you want to call it, ADOS, FBA, whatever, like myself, whether you're mixed race and that's a part of your background, or whether you're monoracial, whatever. Let's say you are that, and then you also have light skin, and you also have curly hair. Then yes, to someone who does not have that many quote unquote privileges working in their favor, that could make them have an extreme inferiority complex. But with that being said, though, I do still think that the colorism talking points are valid. I think everybody deserves their own space to talk about their own issues and stuff. But I absolutely think that some people are simply jealous of people who have an African American background in particular. And so I think that one of the ways that people try to combat that jealousy is by narcissistically abusing those with African American ancestry, because the Hispanic side of YouTube did that to me. When I first came on here, they tried to, because I'm not fluent in Spanish, because I don't identify with the same struggles in the Hispanic community, because I don't identify with a lot of those same struggles, then a lot of people try to call me privileged or even xenophobic, or even, not being a real quote unquote Hispanic. First of all, what the fuck is a real Hispanic? So I have noticed that sometimes people who feel the most underprivileged, they want to then become the queen or the king of that community, and then they want to be able to kick others out of that community. They want to throw you in and out. And so for those of you who also have some sort of Hispanic background or a background from another country, maybe you have a background from another country, but it goes so far back in your ancestry as far as the immigration, it goes back far enough to where people from that actual place, they don't want to accept you because they feel like, no, you're Americanized. And it's like, okay, well, what's the problem? Like, what are you talking about? I'm Americanized, as if that's bad. And then you're in America as well. So it's like, oh, you guys are Americanized. You guys are so ignorant. Americans are the most uneducated people. People from the United States, they don't know anything about other countries. Okay, so with that being said, wouldn't you not want to be in a country with all of us uneducated people then? Wouldn't you not want to be here then? So that's the thing. Like, I can understand where a lot of African Americans are coming from when they make comments like that, because it's like, well, if the United States sucks, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say like, oh my God, the United States is like, woo, put it on a pedestal. I'm not trying to put it on a pedestal, but I'm saying like, I don't go to other people's countries and disrespect where they're from. I don't disrespect other people's countries. I don't disrespect other people's cultures. I don't call people from an entire country uneducated. That's extremely rude. Like, I would never come on here and say Mexican people are uneducated or Haitian people are uneducated. I wouldn't say something like that because that's idiotic. Not only is that untrue, but that's idiotic. That's stereotypical. Anybody who makes comments like that is obviously very monocultural. They've probably not really traveled. They've probably not had the opportunity to travel a lot. And so because of that, they're making all of these really big stereotypes. And I have noticed a problem in the mainstream colorism space, to where a lot of the creators, they're not talking about their nationalities or like their backgrounds and how their cultural differences could have hindered them. Instead, I see a lot of people just blaming everything on, oh, everybody's a colorist. You didn't want to date me because you're colorist. You didn't want to date me because you're texturist and featurist. And it's like, well, no, what if that person just wanted to date someone who was also from the same cultural background as them? So yeah, like African American or whatever. You know how people try to say, oh, dark-skinned black women, they get married last, or like nobody wants to date or marry an African American woman. I believe that that's false, because number one, the people who say that, they usually don't know how statistics work. They don't understand that when people are trying to create a statistic or they're like doing a study or something, they have a control group. Okay, so they're only studying a couple thousand people. They're only studying, 2,000 people, 5,000 people, maybe even 40,000 people. So they still have a sample size. Those studies do not necessarily represent the entirety of the American population. So this whole idea that nobody wants to marry you or date you if you are a dark-skinned black woman, and then the people that like go on dating apps and compare themselves to people lighter, it's like, in some cases, I really do feel like people don't take into consideration, no, maybe it's not your skin tone or your phenotype. Part of this could be a cultural difference. Some people want to marry a person who speaks English as their first language, or a person who they can understand, they have the same cultural background, they eat the same foods, they celebrate the same holidays. So calling that colorism, that's actually not colorism. Wanting to interact with someone who has the same cultural background, that's not colorism. That's just somebody wanting to date within their own culture or within their own nationality, or, dating somebody who has the same like rituals as you, the same religion as you. And so I do think that a lot of the mainstream colorism channels definitely look past those nuances and just blame everything on you're a colorist, texturist, or featurist. And I also think that a lot of people will not admit that they pedestalize African American media. I don't really like calling it African American media, because it's really not. It's really owned by white people still. Like, if you look at the people who are in charge of the entire music industry, those are white men. If you look at people who created Hollywood and who are in charge of Hollywood, those are also white men. So, but I feel like sometimes people don't understand that, especially if you are not American, or maybe your history is not even here in the United States. Maybe your parents just got here in the 70s or something, or like, your grandparents came here. So maybe some of those people are just taking in whatever their parents said, or they have internalized the inferiority complexes of their parents and grandparents. But I do think a lot of people pedestalize Black American media. And so when they see mixed Americans, representing unambiguous Black Americans, then it can make their inferiority complexes worse because they feel like, wait a minute, so not only am I not from the United States, not only do I not have the skin tone or hair texture or whatever, but then now you've got the American media, the Black American media, or the people who are kind of pedestalized in Hollywood, they all represent a certain phenotype. And so you've got inferiority complex on top of inferiority complex on top of inferiority complex. And yes, I do think that a lot of the non-ADOS colorism content creators do not talk about that and don't talk about how many of those colorism talking points came from the people who were from other countries. Because, for example, when people say, oh, I didn't like my skin tone because somebody called it ugly. Who called your skin tone ugly? Was it your Nigerian father? Was it, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, like I'm being honest, like, was it your Nigerian father? Was it your Haitian father? Was it your Haitian mother? Who called your skin tone ugly? What country were they from? What background are they from? Because like I said, my parents are from the United States. They were still born in the United States. My grandparents were still born in the United States. All of my great-grandparents were still born in the United States. So yes, by DNA and by culture, obviously I'm a multiracial, multicultural Black woman. But those are questions you may want to ask yourself though. Like, if you have experienced a lot of colorism, texturism, and featurism, who said the first featurist comments to you? Was it your mother that was from another country, or did she say, oh, hey, back in XYZ country, we would be considered ugly? That is something to think about. And by the way, I'm not trying to say that colorism doesn't exist amongst African Americans, because I do think it exists. And that's why I said that these people, they still are valid in their talking points. They still have freedom of speech, just like anyone else. But yes, I have noticed that a lot of the mainstream colorism content creators do not address the nuances that come from their own cultural backgrounds. Instead, a lot of them want to rage bait African American women, and they want to try to convince a lot of the African American women that, like, oh, light skins hate you or mixed women hate you. People have tried to come on my channel. Unambiguous women have tried to talk crap about this community, and then they'll say, oh, Exoticals United doesn't view light-skinned Black women as exoticals. First of all, the term exotical was never a race. That was literally just a slang term that I took from channels like Chrissy or Cynthia G, and I took it from their comment section where people were using the slang term exotical to describe anyone who was not an unambiguous monoracial dark-skinned Black woman, because a lot of those spaces were exclusive to unambiguous monoracial dark-skinned Black women. And so I made a channel where I'm like, look, if you can't relate to the experiences or the phenotypes of those women, then this channel might resonate with you a little bit more. And the only people who are confused about what my platform is for are people who are unambiguous, monoracial, dark-skinned Black women. Those are the only people who are confused. The people who are not a part of my core audience. The people who do not identify with being accused of having all these privileges. But I've noticed that a lot of the other colorism content creators, they have used rage baiting to profit off of the insecurities of not just Black women who have histories in other countries, but also African American women. And I do think that the whole colorism, texturism, featurism thing could have become worse, or it could have made women even more insecure. And it's not just the content creators themselves. I'm thinking about the little girls. I'm thinking about like the Gen Z little girls that are being born, or like, the younger women who are coming up and who were 13 years old watching videos talking about how, they're the least protected, they're the least provided for, or, he only wants to get with you because you're easier to sleep with because you have dark skin and kinky hair. Like, I can only imagine if I was told that when I was 13 years old, oh, I'd have low self-esteem too. I would have the biggest inferiority complex ever. If I got told stuff like that, I'd be very depressed. So that's why I wanted to create a space that was, number one, more uplifting, but also over here, we don't want to associate with the unambiguous experience. Like, we don't relate to the unambiguous monoracial dark-skinned Black women's experience. We don't relate to that. We don't relate to kind of the inferiority complexes that come from those spaces. And if we do relate to them, we relate to them in a different way. So for example, maybe you have experienced people resenting you because you are light-skinned. So you know what colorism is, but you've had people dislike you or resent you because of your color. And by the way, I use Alice Walker's definition of colorism on this channel. If you don't know who Alice Walker is, she is the author of The Color Purple. She is well known in the Black community. So that's the definition of colorism I'm using on here. And I've noticed that people will say things like, oh, well, I want to have a conversation about colorism, but you don't understand the definition of the word conversation. A conversation means it's between two people. You're talking back and forth. You hear both sides. And so why is it that the colorism conversation can only be dominated by unambiguous monoracial dark-skinned women who are, in a lot of cases, who are what? First generation, second generation in the United States? So don't you think that they would have a lot of nuanced experiences that a lot of even unambiguous African American women would not have? Because think about like a person that immigrates to the United States, or why they immigrate to the United States, or the whole process of, getting educated in their own countries, or saving up all that money and buying their way in, or like somehow making a way into the United States. Think about all of that and all of the different traumas and difficulties that are associated with that. Think about the discrimination that Black immigrants face in the United States. So that's a whole other beast right there. And so I really think that oftentimes people throw something into colorism, but it could be a form of racism, just overall racism. And also for the people who do not like those from other countries, I think that can also be a part of it as well. But notice how a lot of the mainstream Black colorism content creators, they don't talk about that. They don't talk about the differences between being a Nigerian American and being an unambiguous African American. Notice how they never talk about that. No, because that would alienate too much of their audience. They want to be able to profit off of the rage of unambiguous African American women, even though a lot of unambiguous African American women can't even relate to the same experiences as unambiguous Nigerian women, like in terms of culture or in terms of like your history. If your whole family that you know of has been born in the United States, yeah, you're going to have a different experience. And also, have you ever noticed that a lot of unambiguous colorism content creators who have immediate ancestry in other countries, to where maybe their parents or grandparents or even a great-grandparent that they have met have immigrated here, have you ever noticed how a lot of those content creators want to suddenly act like they are the king or queen of blackness and get to determine who gets to use the term black and who doesn't? No, that's not how society works. Nobody died and made you the king or queen of who gets to represent blackness or who gets to participate in Black culture. The bottom line is that the Black community is extremely hypocritical. They like to throw people in and out of blackness, and so by doing that, they give those of us with ambiguity a privilege. They didn't realize that they're actually giving us a privilege by throwing us in and out of blackness, because now we get to have fluid identities. So whether you are a light-skinned monoracial, your skin tone is a form of ambiguity. So guess what? You're going to get thrown in and out of the Black experience. And guess what? That fluid identity is something that you can utilize to your advantage. For those of you who think that's immoral and, you shouldn't profit off of Black people. Okay, well, do you say that to Walmart when you go in there and shop? Do you say that to all the white companies that you shop at? You're not thinking about who's the owner of this company before you go shopping. Do you say that to the white guy that you're dating? You're not thinking about that. So why is it that suddenly when I say, oh, hey, yeah, you're right, you're giving us fluid identities by making us, by throwing us in and out of blackness. You are granting us two different titles in society. You are granting us the title of Black, and you're also granting us the title of multiracial, biracial, mixed. Or let's say you are monoracial, but you benefit from an ism. You're giving them the title of Blackness, and you're also giving them the title of being privileged. You're giving them the title of Blackness, and you're also giving them the title of light-skinned, which is a subset. People try to make that like a subset of blackness. Okay, so you just gave them a fluid identity. You gave them a fluid identity as opposed to unambiguous monoracial dark-skinned blackness, which means no matter what, you never get mistaken as anything else, and you deal with kind of the harsher negative stereotypes of blackness. Okay, so by separating us out and dividing it up based on that, just recognize that you are granting a fluid identity to anyone who has both blackness and ambiguity in their identity, because you're pointing it out. You're pointing out the ambiguities of other types of Black people, whether it's a biracial, a triracial Black person. When I use the term triracial, I'm talking about those who have three races in their background. So biracial means you only have two races. Triracial is you have three. So for example, Creoles, if you have Black in your background, white in your background, you've got some Native in your background, Latinas, Afro-Latinas, you've got like black, white, indigenous ancestry. So you're granting those people both blackness and also non-blackness or ambiguity or privilege, even if it's just based on hair texture or based on their facial features. You are still giving them two titles in society. You are telling them you are the privileged black woman. You are the woman who benefits from featurism and texturism. Okay, so then don't get mad when women like that come to channels like this, and then we get to talk about all of our nuances. And for the people who say, oh, this is not important, other people are like, they're dominating other countries right now, and you guys are sitting on YouTube. It's like, first of all, who are the other people? You mean white people? Just admit that you pedestalize white people and move on. I have the right to talk about whatever I want to on YouTube. And if other people can talk about things from their perspective, then I can talk about things from mine. So if you want to go and worship the white man, please do that on another channel. This is not the channel for you. And so I do think that in some cases there is almost like this double jealousy, because there is a jealousy of being born and raised in the United States and having family that was born and raised in the United States. And also there could be a jealousy over phenotype. So that's already two different forms of jealousy right there. So jealous of your phenotype and also jealous of your actual nationality. I never really associated America with like, oh my God, put it on a pedestal. But I have noticed that other countries, people in other countries do sometimes pedestalize the United States. And to say that they don't would be disingenuous. I mean, I know myself from watching telenovelas that there is a huge pedestal that people put the United States on. I mean, people act like the United States is like you're just walking on streets of gold. In fact, I have been told that. Like when I went to Mexico, there was a guy he was literally talking like that. And he said the United States was perfect and that everybody is so rich. And, so for some people who are from other countries, I understand not all. If you come on my comment section and say not all, you'll immediately be banned. But I understand that some people who have backgrounds in other countries view being an American itself as a form of privilege. And so not only are you triggering sometimes an inferiority complex around phenotype and around race, but you're also triggering an inferiority complex around the country that person is from. Obviously, you guys know that this is the Exoticals United channel, so I don't care about what country your background is from. Like I said, most of us on here, we've got backgrounds from so many different countries around the world, but I do believe there are some people who are jealous if you were born and raised in the United States, and if your parents were born and raised in the United States, and your grandparents and great-grandparents were born and raised in the United States. And I am speaking from experience here because I know of people of all races who maybe they're like first generation, second generation. And a lot of people, their parents didn't know how to fill out the FAFSA form for them to go to college and stuff. Or they didn't know about the different governmental programs that they could use to help them out, or, how to do different administrative tasks, or they didn't know about the different nuances of things that can help you here in the United States, whether it's government programs, whether it's like scholarship opportunities and things like that. Even media opportunities or opportunities to do like modeling or whatever, or be in Hollywood. Has anyone else noticed that a lot of people who are not African American, has anyone else noticed that a lot of the colorism content creators, they have this obsession with Hollywood, this pedestalization, this extreme pedestalization of American Hollywood? And it's like, why are we basing our entire self-esteem on Hollywood? And don't get me wrong, I know that like the media matters and what you see matters. But there are other forms of media. Social media is a form of media, hence the name. And so this obsession, I have noticed that there is sometimes a stronger obsession on these YouTube channels, on the colorism channels, where the women have direct lineage from these other countries, and they're obsessed with like American, Hollywood, and who got a record deal and who did this. But if you were born and raised in the United States, and your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were all born and raised in the United States like me, regardless of whether you're mixed, you understand that just because someone's famous today in Hollywood doesn't mean they'll be famous tomorrow. So I feel like some people, they pedestalize Hollywood, American Hollywood, so much so to the point where they think that if you're a one-hit wonder in Hollywood, you're just going to leave this amazing legacy and like, oh my God, it's going to change the world. And I have noticed that, like an extreme pedestalization of Hollywood media. For me personally, I barely watch any movies at all. I do have Netflix, but I don't have Hulu or any of the other ones. I don't really have time to even take in that much media. And I can't tell you how many times I have watched colorism channels, and then there's like this pedestalization of Hollywood. They'll be talking about some artist that I've never even heard of. I would have never known who Mariah the Scientist was, Ice Spice, or any of these other people if it weren't for unambiguous colorism content creators, a lot of whom have a non-African American background in their immediate family, like within three generations. If it weren't for them posting about these people, we wouldn't even know who these people were. I've also noticed that a lot of the confident, unambiguous African American women don't have a problem with my channel, because a lot of people have women in their family, or, you know, whether it's their grandparent or great grandparent or a cousin or somebody who looks like me. And I know that not every African American looks like Beyonce. That's also disingenuous. I also don't like when people say that, when they're like, oh, everybody looks like Lori Harvey, everybody looks like Beyonce. No, that's just who you pay attention to the most. I have gone to an HBCU. I have lived in multiple cities where the majority of the population is African American, and the average person walking down the street does not look like Lori Harvey. The average person walking around in a Walmart in the hoods of Detroit does not look like Lori Harvey. So that's a disingenuous talking point right there. But I've noticed that for some people, they pedestalize that phenotype so much that they ignore all of the other nuances of being in the United States. They ignore all of the other ethnic groups, or the people who say, oh, people who are light-skinned, they look like a regular, everyday, unambiguous black woman. And in terms of features, in terms of facial features or hair textures, that could be correct. But in terms of their skin tone, anybody who actually has been in a multiracial or multicultural part of the United States knows damn well that there are Filipinos with Chloe and Halle's skin tone. There are Pacific Islanders and Native Americans who have Chloe and Halle's skin tone. They would know that there are people who have ancestry in India with Chloe and Halle's skin tone. Do you know how many other types of people of color there are? So anybody who says, oh, you know, that caramel or golden skin tone, nobody else has that skin tone except for black people, that's completely false. That's idiotic. And then for the people who say, oh, we all came from Africa and like everybody is African. Okay, so then why are you even making channels about racism, colorism, texturism, and featurism? Let's not be stupid here, okay? This channel discusses the nuances of those who have both blackness as a part of their identity as well as ambiguity. And so I have noticed that sometimes non-African American people want to come not only into Black American YouTube, for lack of better words, but sometimes there's also this thing where it's like, oh no, I get to decide who's black and who's not. And it's like, well, at the end of the day, race still is a social construct. And until people put a percentage on what blackness is, which they never will, by the way, because, you know, politics and stuff like that, they're never going to do that. And so guess what? We get to have a fluid identity. So we get to call ourselves by whatever ethnic nicknames we want. We get to identify by ethnicity if we want. We get to call our skin tone whatever nicknames we want. And we also get to be placed in and out of blackness at will. So guess what? The first Black Miss America, or like all these pageant titles, first Black this, first Black Teen USA, first Black whatever, a lot of those people have mixed race ancestry. But guess what? They also get the title of first Black president, first Black vice president. Okay, so guess what? We're going to continue to have those fluid identities because a lot of people, they don't understand that like there's never going to be a consensus about what's black and what's not. And so until there is at a macro level, we over here in the Exoticals United community will continue to play on both our blackness and our ambiguity. We have a right to make money in the black community and in the non-black community. So for those people who say, oh, Beyonce wouldn't have money if it weren't for unambiguous women, you're damn right. And guess what? You guys, unambiguous women and men, well, it's mainly unambiguous women because she really has a lot of women in her audience, not to mention unambiguous gay black men who are living vicariously through Beyonce. You guys make her rich, and you guys make us, women of our phenotype, rich all the time. And so until people start putting their money where their mouth is, we will continue to have the privilege of having fluid identities. And that's just the bottom line. And for the people who get mad when I use the P word, privilege, a lot of people, you know, you can't use that word around people of color. But it's like, no, if we're talking about topics like colorism, texturism, and featurism, we also need to talk about privilege. And so privilege isn't going anywhere. Pedestals aren't going anywhere because, you know, capitalism is also not going anywhere. And so we're not going to downplay ourselves or like not speak out or not have YouTube channels because other people feel inferior or because other people have inferiority complexes. And have you guys noticed how a lot of featurism is really just featurism against West African features, which a lot of African Americans have because of the West African slave trade? I understand that there were also slaves traded here from other parts of Africa, but for the most part, a lot of us have, whether it's Ghanaian features or, you know, that's somewhere in our phenotype, some sort of West African features. Have you ever noticed how when these colorism ADOS content creators talk about people being ugly, such as Ice Spice, or somebody who has, you know, African, clear West African features, they want to pretend like, oh no, it's just because she's ugly. And then if you ask, why are they ugly? Like name features, name what parts of her face are ugly. Then they go silent because they don't want to admit that they are featurist against West African features in particular. So basically, the common features that you would see in an unambiguous African American person, I've noticed that sometimes anti-ADOS colorism creators, they will call people ugly or basic looking if they have African American features, which are basically West African. So, for example, on Chrissy's video that she has now hidden, where she was talking about a quote unquote basic looking light skinned woman, that woman had West African facial features, particularly her nose. That video that Chrissy hid with the woman in the goggles who had kind of like a larger West African nose, she called her basic. She said she's a basic looking light woman. So notice how it's often people who have internalized colorism, texturism, and featurism who try to project that onto other people where it's like, we weren't even thinking about that, or like that wasn't even a talking point. And then if you ask some of these colorism content creators to discuss the nuances of their communities versus in America, oftentimes they will ignore that, and obviously they don't want to talk about that because then their audiences are going to realize, oh, wait a minute, these women have a different cultural background than me. You know, their family is from an entirely different place, and so a lot of the negative skin tone comments and stuff that they received could have been from their direct family members who actually came from Nigeria or somewhere else. And also, why do we never talk about bleaching? The skin bleaching, like the main people who purchase skin bleaching products, it's definitely more common in Africa versus here. And I'm not trying to say that like people can't bleach in America, because they can, but if you look at the FDA and if you look at the laws here in the United States, it's actually illegal to sell hydroquinone products that have more than about 2% hydroquinone. So if you get like the Ambi Fade Cream that has 2% hydroquinone, so it's going to lighten your skin just barely. If you go to a dermatologist, you can get 4% hydroquinone. But all of these creams where people's skin is like getting burnt up, those people in those countries, it's because in their country, they don't really care. In their country, they are allowed to sell products that have 30% hydroquinone or like super high levels of lactic acid and super high levels of mercury. Here in the United States, you can't even purchase that. You can't, like all those things where they say, oh, if you go to the beauty supply store, those are the creams that are going to make you like Michael Jackson. No, they're actually not. And if you don't believe me, I can do a whole separate video where I pull up articles and I pull up lists of ingredients. They're actually not, because in the United States, you can't do that shit. You can't just sell shit. Well, unless you're backed by the government, of course. But for the most part, you can't just sell shit that's going to like burn people's skin up. You will get sued. In America, they have a whole entire legal process where you can sue a company. Like if you put stuff on your skin and like, you know, your skin gets super burnt up, you can sue that person and say, hey, you know, this causes cancer. They have all types of advocates here in the United States where they will say, hey, relaxers cause cancer, or they'll have like a whole thing where they are influencing people and telling people, hey, don't purchase this because it has unhealthy ingredients. If you go to other countries, especially countries where their economies are struggling or countries that are collapsed or whatever, they don't have that. And so why does no one talk about the entire skin bleaching industry that is mainly surviving based off of a lot of the countries in Africa? You know, the people that try to accuse light-skinned African-American women of bleaching? How do you know so many details about bleaching? Let's talk about that. How do you know so many details about bleaching in the first place? How can you tell based on a teeny tiny mark on someone's skin that they are bleaching unless you yourself have looked up bleaching or have tried to do it or you are doing it? And it's like, if you're going to call it out, let's call it out everywhere, not just with light-skinned, mixed race African-American women like Beyonce. Let's call it out everywhere. Let's talk about the multi-billion-dollar skin bleaching industry that is profiting in different countries in Africa. And so, yes, I have noticed that a lot of non-African-American or people who don't have a lot of history here in the United States, I have noticed sometimes some of the talking points are kind of more of a problem maybe in their home countries and stuff versus here. But what do you ladies think? Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed how a lot of the main colorism content creators, they don't seem to make content about what's going on in maybe their countries of origin, or how their countries of origin could have influenced their own personal beliefs, or how maybe the inferiority complexes that people had in their countries of origin could have been much stronger than people here in America? Because like I said, Black Americans, in my opinion, are the most privileged Black people in the world. This is why I have little to no empathy, especially if Black men come on here and say, oh, well, the government took us out of the home. Get out of here with that bullshit, because you are still one of the most privileged men in the world. Same thing with the women. You're still some of the most privileged women in the world. I don't care what your skin tone is. I don't care what your hair texture is. And by the way, I'm not trying to like just worship America, like, oh my God, this is the best country ever. But to deny those things as being advantages, it's disingenuous. People tell us all the time, you need to acknowledge your privilege. Okay, so then acknowledge your privileges that you have as being a person who you still have access to different opportunities. Yeah, of course, they may not be as good as someone else, but they're also not as bad as other people. But what do you ladies think? Let me know in the comment section, and I'll talk to you next time. Stay pretty, ladies.